This event is made possible by the President's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board, the Fowle Library, the Faculty Center for Excellence in the History Department, and thanks to Dr. Kelly Campbell, Vice Provost for Academic Programs, Co-Chief Diversity Officer, and to Ben Dykstra and Pamela Crossan for their administrative support. None of this is possible without them. I also want to thank Marcy Iniguez and the Faculty Center for Excellence for letting us join here. Our two guests today are Neema Avashia and Elizabeth Catte. Neema Avashia was born and raised in southern West Virginia to parents who immigrated to the United States. She's been a middle school civics teacher in the Boston Public Schools since 2003. Her essays have appeared in the Bitter Southerner, Catapult, Kenyon Review Online, and elsewhere. In her recent book, Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, was a 2023 Lambda Literary Award finalist, and it was named the best LGBTQ+ memoir of 2022 by Book Riot. It was also a New York Public Library Best Book of 2022, as well as being a Weatherford Award finalist in nonfiction. And some of you are walking away today with that book, and I hope you enjoy it. We're going to hear a little bit about it today. Elizabeth Catte lives in Virginia and has written two books, What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia in 2018, and Pure America, Eugenics and the Making of Modern Virginia, 2021. Pure America made the 2022 PEN American Literary Awards long list for the PEN John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction and was named a Publishers Weekly Best Book of 2021. Her essays and commentary have appeared in the Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, NPR, and more. She runs PASL, an applied history consulting firm with her partner Josh, using history to solve real-world problems in Appalachia and the Mid-Atlantic. Catte holds a PhD in public history and is a member of the National Writers Union, the Authors Guild, and a board member of the Appalachian African American Cultural Center in Pennington Gap, Virginia. I'll share links to both of the books in the virtual chat. I will also share links to both Liz and Neema's web pages so that those of you joining us online will be able to check that out. And you'll be able to get their books if you haven't already. Also, at the end of the talk, I'll do a quick raffle for those of you who are joining us online, and it'll be just a guess the number. Maybe Neema or Liz can choose a number, and we can see if we can get several of you who are due to the fires or for any other reason are unable to join us, and I can mail out a few more copies of the book. Sorry for all of the throat clearing here. But we do have to get a few of these things out of the way quickly, and also apologies for the late start here. I want to open the floor first to our guests. I have questions after having read both of these books and really thoroughly enjoyed them. But I first want to open the floor to both Liz and Neema, if you want to give some preliminary remarks.
I'll go first. Hey, Neema. That's all the preliminary remarks I had. I just wanted to say, like, such a warm welcome to Neema. We've not, like, due to the pandemic and all this kind of stuff, and we've not ever chatted personally. So this is a real treat for me, and I want to thank you, Jeremy, Professor Murray, for facilitating this.
Hi, Liz. And Jeremy, thank you so much for putting this together. Liz, thanks so much for inviting me to come be in conversation with you. I've said this to you before, but I want to make sure everybody here knows it. My book doesn't exist without this book. I was born and raised in Southern West Virginia, but for a very long time, like, I did not know how to locate myself within Appalachia. I didn't know if I could use the word Appalachian to describe myself because the dominant narratives about Appalachia did not include people like me. And so despite having been born there and raised there and sort of raised with the traditions of the place, it was unclear to me, can a person of South Asian descent whose family immigrated to the region be considered Appalachian? And then I read Liz's book in 2018, and I found, like, breath. I found the ability to sort of locate myself in this region and to locate myself in a tradition that was so much bigger than me. that sort of encompasses this history of migration to Appalachia that's been going on for hundreds of years of different immigrant communities, but that have been there, that helped me to understand my relationship to Black folks who've been in Appalachia for generations, and that helped me to understand counter narrative and how important it is that when there's a dominant narrative about a place that dehumanizes people the way that the dominant narrative about Appalachia does, the role of counter narrative becomes urgent, because counter narrative is how we humanize people and how we make sure that regions are given what they deserve, and that the people in those regions are protected and cared for in the ways that they deserve to be. And so I sort of feel like Liz's book makes space on the shelf for so many other books, in a way that space didn't exist prior to the writing of her book. It helps us to sort of understand what is the context in which all of our work is happening and how do we relate to each other. So I'm super grateful to be here, grateful to be in conversation with Liz. Thanks, Jeremy, for having us here, and I'm psyched to sort of just be in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Neema, and thanks, Liz. Thanks both for the kind words. And I'm going to step over here just to sort of say hi. I don't know if more or less. Oh, there. Okay, you can see me. And a really great thanks to you both. I feel like I am not a historian of I say Appalachia. I'm from New York. Appalachia. We can argue about that. But I think although I'm not a scholar of Appalachia, I studied China actually. I grew up in upstate New York. And I think at this point, I have done my part for Appalachian studies by bringing together these two really cool people for a conversation. And as I said to both of you in our earlier notes, just sort of being a fly on the wall in a discussion between the two of you about your respective perspectives and your scholarship and your writing, I think is really is already really a treat for all of us here. But I do have a couple notes that I made, and I'll just we'll sort of see where things go. But again, I grew up in a small town in eastern upstate New York, surrounded by the Appalachian Mountains, the Catskills, the Taconics, the Berkshires, the Green Mountains. And some may question rural New York's status as Appalachian or Appalachian. And some may, I think maybe that could be a good place to start for us. Can we start with a rough working definition of what we mean by Appalachia? Bearing in mind again, and this is important, and again, as thinking about counter narratives and the complexity of the discourse today in this country, that this discussion will include, and we can flag some of the stereotypes, the prejudices, and the really hasty understandings of the region. So that's maybe my first prompt to the two of you.
Liz, that's you.
Yeah, I make the historian answer the question. So briefly, Appalachia is just the Appalachian communities and counties of 13 states. It is a creation of an entity called the Appalachian Regional Commission that came into existence as part of Johnson's war on poverty. Okay, so it's a political construction, and that's the way that I think is good to kind of just think about and talk about it. Disregard culture for a moment. Geographically, Appalachia is just the Appalachian counties of 13 states that kind of buttress the Appalachian Mountains. Now, within that, the way that people have recently started to talk about Appalachia is that there's urban Appalachia, rural Appalachia, north, central, and southern Appalachia, and all of those distinctions are valuable and worth consideration. I think that in terms of culture, in terms of politics, in terms of heritage, Appalachia is a really complex place. And so we even kind of parse it further by saying there's Appalachia that exists in sort of like narrative. There's Appalachian that exists within people on the ground. There's Appalachian that exists within like very specific communities, very specific mountain communities. There's people who define themselves as Afro-Latin, and I think, Neema, you use the word Indo-Latin to describe your heritage. And so there's pockets of communities that subdivine themselves. And so it's a big mix of people, and to keep it simple, I think it's good to just kind of focus on geography, because what can be really distracting is these conversations that we have. Who is Appalachian and who is not Appalachian? I'm from urban Ohio, am I Appalachian? You're from the mountains of West Virginia. Are you, like, who is more Appalachian? This Appalachian chauvinism can come into place, and everybody feels the need to kind of state their bona fides when they talk about the region. Like, I'm from the smallest, I'm from like the smallest backwater in the world. I was, unconnected by telephones. I had no electricity in my house. Therefore, I'm more Appalachian than somebody who grew up and, went to college and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, let's just keep it easy.
Yeah, and I just would add to that I think Appalachia is also a construct, right? And has been constructed by media in this country in a very, very specific way. As white, working class, Christian, and rural. And that definition has felt very constraining, I think, to lots of people the whole time. In addition to the groups that Liz mentioned, like queer folks in Appalachia have sometimes referred to themselves as Fabulachian, right? Because even queerness, the question of queerness and like, does queerness put us on the outside of this rigid construct, has been sometimes hard for people to negotiate. But it is also a term that gets weaponized in a lot of ways. And we're seeing that right now, right? The question of like who gets to speak for Appalachia is a question that that Liz speaks to directly in her book in terms of its response to J.D. Vance. And it continues to be a conversation right now of like who gets to speak for this place. And I think we have strong feelings about who gets to speak for it versus who is getting to speak for it.
Both, and that's actually the reason did we lose video somehow? Sorry, I'm not sure how that happened. That last point you noted, Neema, is the reason I think I when I heard about the VP pick, I quickly said we've got to have a nice conversation out here in California about what people are talking about over there, and sort of hasty understandings. And I had read Liz's book, and Liz told me about your book, and that led us here. So this is really a really exciting conversation. The next note I have here is for Liz. Liz, your 2018 book, What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia, and I'll change the way I say that now because I've heard you all say it a few times, so I'll move forward now. But
You
Liz,
don't need to, Jeremy. It's like it's another one of those things that people fight about. That's a waste of time to fight about. Plenty of people say Appalachia.
Well,
it's
we
okay.
have out here. I also changed the way I talk about highways out here. Everybody says the 10 or the 210, and when I go back east and I refer to the 95, everybody looks at me funny. But these are sort of regionalisms. Liz, your 2018 book, starting on the title page, I think could be described as combative, and I think that in the best way. I found it to be bracing and essential reading. I nodded along on each page. You waited until page 9, I think, to drop the first F-bomb, to sort of get everybody's attention, I think. Can you talk a little bit about the tone that you aim to strike with this book? And maybe a note on the context and the moment in which you researched and wrote the book.
So I wrote the book 2016 and 2017. Didn't take long to write. It was a very short writing process. The book itself is pretty slim. And I wrote the book in response to a lot of media coverage that was coming out about Appalachia and sort of this narrative that Appalachia was Trump country, meaning that if Trump won the election, it would be through the political power of people in Appalachia. And not only was that sort of statistically wrong, these pieces were drawing on a lot of Appalachian stereotypes. Sometimes they were front and center, sometimes they were just in the background. Reporters were going to the same place and interviewing the same people. And there was also, the emergence of hillbilly elegy as a memoir, and the idea that, J.D. Vance could be the Appalachia whisperer. And so when I wrote the book, I wanted to do an exercise, like Neema said, in writing counter narrative, which means that my book doesn't reflect all of Appalachian history. It doesn't talk about any, all groups that make up Appalachia, but it starts with the idea that if what someone like J.D. Vance says is true, and the media kind of lifts up this example as the most, I don't know, useful story about Appalachia, then why can't mine be true too? And so why can't my my Appalachia, for example, there's socialists in it, there's Black people, there's brown people, there's queer people, there's strife, there's working class people aiming to change the nature of their labor and the conditions under which they labor. There's people fighting against environmental disaster. There's people who have agency, and a sense of identity and a sense of complexity about who they are. And so my book was an attempt to say, like, if these stories about degradation are true, why can't my version be true? And it wasn't that I didn't want my book to be criticized. I didn't want I didn't want people to say like, oh, this is the better version. It was about answering that question, is why is it so easy to like look at this version of Appalachia and say, oh yeah, everything this person says makes sense. This thing about people who are helpless, people who are, opioid addicted, people who are racist, misogynistic, homophobic, a world in which Black and brown people and queer people do not even exist. Why is this version the one that we're more interested in versus this one that is a little bit more diverse and asks some more challenging questions about what Appalachia is and who people in Appalachia are. So that's why the tone is a little bit combative. And I had some like really interesting experiences over the course of writing that book where, it like nominated to be the anti-JD Vance for a little while, back in that period when he was just sort of like a pundit and public head. And so I would kind of follow along in institutions where he had done a speaking engagement, and then they would invite me out of sort of like balance a couple months later, to give the other side. And it was, kind of flattering at first and then really annoying. And I remember one speaking engagement was at where I got my undergraduate degrees. And it was just such a weird feeling, and I articulated it. And I was a little bit snarky, but I was like, how dare you bring me here to give the counter narrative? I grew up in this city. I went to school here. You gave me degrees. Why am I the rebuttal to this? And unfortunately, several years later, we're not really asking, like, we've not really moved on from that question. And like the best example of that is like, who is the Republican vice presidential pick? But that reminds me of something I think I read that Neema said once, which was when you're writing your memoir, well, after you'd written your memoir, and you were trying to find a publisher, that you had to go through this weird process of hearing about how you would be marketed and you would be sold. And that kind of question about who gets to be like the Appalachian in the news at any given time. It's like Highlander, there can only be one. And I would like to hear more about that from Neema, actually, if you don't mind, because I had my own experiences, but I imagine that yours were a little bit more fraught.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like the sort of big five publishing world was not interested in my story, because it doesn't serve the dominant narrative about Appalachia, right? Like, people would say, this is a beautiful book, and we don't know how to sell it. We don't know who would read it. Which effectively says we don't know anyone who would be interested in this counter narrative about place, or in the idea that there could be other communities in this place. And I had to go home to find a publisher who understood my story and understood who would want to read my story, which was people in Appalachia, certainly. My book is published by West Virginia University Press, which is the only university press in the state of West Virginia, and has done a pretty tremendous job, I think, of lifting up counter narratives for a very long time. That's the work that they do. But I think that it does speak to Liz's point, which is the reason why she follows Vance instead of being the first person they talk to, or the reason why my book isn't something that people understand how to market, is because that story doesn't sell because it doesn't serve. there are a lot of people who are served by narratives about Appalachia that make Appalachian people not human. It is easier to extract all the resources from a place and leave the land and water and air poisoned if the people who live there aren't seen as people by the rest of the country. It's a lot easier to build prisons where there used to be coal mines and sort of push this narrative that the economic rejuvenation of a place is going to be based on incarceration when you've sort of told everybody who lives there and the people who live outside of there, the people there aren't really people anyway. So if we lock them up, we're not hurting anybody, we're helping, right? It's a lot easier to sort of let climate change induced flooding go unaddressed for years and years, as in Eastern Kentucky for the last 2 years. People are still living in their cars after those floods. When people outside the region are saying things like, well, that's what you get if you vote for Mitch McConnell, because they've been taught that your vote is more important than your humanity. I think I learned a real lesson about the place that I was from in the process of trying to publish my book, because I learned that people didn't see people who I love and care about as people. And that is a really painful thing to reckon with, but it also is the kind of thing that made me feel like I really needed to write my book. Because that was a thing I felt like I could do, is I could show you that people are human and complicated and messy, just the way everybody is all over the place. But I could write a book where people weren't flat and dehumanized in the way that I think the dominant narrative about Appalachia continues to really render people in the place as not fully human.
Thank you, Liz, for that earlier note. And I agree certainly with the tone. And again, I was really nodding along with it. And then for Neema's book, Neema, I think to some extent you answered this next question a little bit, but maybe you can build on it. Your book as a personal memoir brings humanity not only to your Indian parents and your family's experience in West Virginia, but you also grapple on the pages with your deep bonds and affections for your neighbors, some of them white, some of them MAGA Republicans now. You remind your reader of the home that your family made, not soft peddling the bigotry you encountered, but also highlighting these complex connections. In this way, there's reconciliation. You offer kindness, understanding to some whose politics may leave no room for your experience or your understanding or your place in the country. I ultimately think that your book is, and this is what I wonder if you agree with, I think your book is ultimately more compassionate even to white Appalachians than Vance's hillbilly elegy. Do you think that's a fair reading or an overstatement?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that, Vance's book is very, very dangerous in a couple ways. Like, I always want to be clear, like, he's entitled to write a memoir. That's his life story. He can tell it. He can throw his mama under the bus if he wants to. That's his business. Where I struggle is with the second part of the subtitle of that book, where it's not just a memoir of a family in crisis, it's a memoir of a culture in crisis, right? And where we go from talking about personal individual experiences to painting all of the people of Jackson, Kentucky in a certain way, or reducing an entire community or region to a set of stereotypes. Because that's just not the case. Like, that's never the case. And in a lot of ways, Vance's narrative about Appalachia is very similar to other culture of poverty narratives that we've seen applied to different groups of people in our country over time. You could take some of the things that he says about white folks in Appalachia, working class white folks in Appalachia, and you could swap out the group name, and those same narratives have been applied to Black folks in this country. Those same narratives have been applied to immigrants in this country. This notion of cultural deficiency is something that I think we have seen be weaponized again and again against different communities. And I guess, I'm a teacher. My orientation is just, I don't function from a deficit orientation. Like, I think it's really important for us to look for, like, what is the good in all of us? Like, what is the wealth that we all possess within us? And I think that's true about people everywhere. And I particularly think it's true about people in Appalachia. There is so much richness. There's so much that the rest of the country actually has to learn from people in Appalachia. And so I think in telling the story of my growing up, like, that's what I wanted to think about. It's not to say that there weren't bad things that happened. It's not to say that I didn't experience racism or that there weren't people who were cruel. All those things happened. And when I weigh out my experience, love by and far outweighs any painful things that happened to me. And so when I tell a story of a place, I want to talk about that love, particularly in a context where I think, again, the dominant narrative about place doesn't afford that. It doesn't make space for what Anne Pancake calls the kinship economy. And Pancake, if you haven't read her, is a phenomenal West Virginia writer. She talks about this idea that in West Virginia and Appalachia, there's this notion of kinship economy where people know that nobody's coming to save you. There is no system that's supporting you. Everybody is at the margins and vulnerable. And so people look for ways to care for one another, because if you don't, you're not going to make it, right? That is a thing that I live in Boston. It doesn't exist here. I could die in my house and my neighbors would have no idea for a long time that it had happened, right? That kind of care or sense of interdependence, it doesn't exist. And I felt like in writing about where I grew up and in just sharing those really specific details, there was an opportunity to challenge that deficit narrative. And to do it from a place of memoir, not from a place of trying to run for office, not from a place of trying to like make big claims about a culture, but to just say, look, if I tell you my real specific story about this street in this town, in this community, maybe that challenges some of these really broad strokes that are being applied to a place. And I think that was my hope, right? It was that the specific details could challenge this sort of generalization that was happening.
Wanted to scurry over to the computer here to get a note here on Anne Pancake so that folks who want to can learn more about her work. I want to open it to again. As I noted at the beginning, I was a little bit draconian with muting everybody, but folks can type questions in the chat. You also can raise your hand virtually or analog if we can see you there. So I want to welcome everybody to join the conversation. And I also want to welcome Liz and Neema to continue to exchange their ideas and questions for each other. There is a second book, and I have not yet read this book, Liz, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And that's Pure America: Eugenics in the Making of Modern Virginia. And the idea of eugenics comes up in both of your books. How did this work come about, Liz? And what are some of the most important themes and findings in the work? How does this work relate to your previous work? How do the ideas of eugenics play into the thinking about poor people, white people, as well as people of color in Appalachia and elsewhere? Is this type of thinking still alive in some ways in the works of Charles Murray and others? And or, what is its latest manifestation?
It's a big question. So I would say, as a historian, my first field was gender and sexuality. And so when I think about Appalachian stereotypes, when I was first thinking about how do I explain these to people, I was trying to think along those terms, because the way that we talk about Appalachia has a lot to do with when we talk about stereotypes of losing control of the emotions, drug addiction, inbreeding, that kind of thing. All of those have commonalities in that they have roots in the eugenics movement, which was a movement that started turn of the 19th century in the United States, still active today, has many permutations, but the idea that your genes essentially represented who you were and what you deserved from society. So people who are poor deserve to be poor. People who are wealthy deserve to be wealthy. Lots of methods focused on coercion and control of reproduction and liberties for people who were thought to be genetically unfit. And so I wanted to highlight that in my book a little bit, because I think that has a lot to do with sort of like the way that Appalachian stereotypes get normalized. The way we talk about cultural deficiencies was really talking about genetic deficiencies. And that's really easy to see if you look at the work of some of the kind of intelligentsia. Jeremy, you mentioned Charles Murray, who's a white supremacist sociologist who was very famous for linking IQ, sort of proving through IQ measurements that or so he thought, that Black people were genetically inferior to white people. This is a book called The Bell Curve that had a big impact on sociology in a negative way in the 1980s. And so these ideas that some people are just doomed, right? That some people are beyond help, have strong eugenic connections for me. And I wanted to talk about that because I thought that that was missing from part of the conversation, particularly if you look at books like Hillbilly Elegy, which was very popular when I wrote my book, and the connections and beliefs that there's something to do with like Scots-Irish heritage. There's something to do with like Appalachian bloodlines that explains why people have a propensity to fail in Appalachia. I mean, that was kind of the subtext of that book and a sideline emphasis that got really sort of ignored by a lot of the people who were praising that book. It was like, oh my God, well, you're saying that people in Appalachia are kind of doomed to fail because they all have the shared genetic heritage. It's weird. It's really weird. So I wanted to draw that out and talk about how some of the eugenic writers of the 1920s and 1930s who came to Appalachia to study people, what they were saying about the region, because they're really stubborn and they really kind of stick with the culture as it changes over time. And if you're interested in sort of other conversations about Appalachian stereotypes that go even further than the eugenics movement way back to the settlement era, you know, there's an author, Stephen Stoll, who wrote a book called Ramp Hollow that talks a lot about how Appalachian stereotypes, both good and bad, are connected to the way that Americans thought nationally about Indigenous people. Because what is sort of unique about, I think, Appalachian stereotypes is the ways that they both, I would say, degrade whiteness and elevate whiteness at the same time. So you have beliefs that Appalachians are degraded, that they have bad stock, that they're sort of like doomed to fail. But also at the same time, you have people who look to white Appalachians as something kind of unique, like almost their own race. And you can sort of see that in modern representations of Appalachia too, even though it kind of slides under the radar outside of those stark terms. This is like the romanticization of Appalachia, of like the pioneer people lost in time. You know, it sounds kind of bad, but there's a way that people also celebrate that as people who haven't lost touch with, you know, whatever, the land, you know, whatever. And so I wanted to be transparent about the intellectual connections of some of those ways of thought. And I did, and when I was kind of doing book talks for the Appalachia book, people wanted to hear more about that. And so I wrote a subsequent book, Pure America, that really dives into, at least, you know, in terms of my local area, how eugenics shaped thought about people and place.
And I was just going to go over here and I'm going to share the link to the book also, and I'll do that in a second. But that's excellent. And I believe it was in your book, Neema, that you noted there were, I could be misremembering because I read them both and then I reread Liz's book, Appalachia book. There are some personal connections, I believe, between Vance and Murray. In terms of public appearances or shared interests, and I'm not sure if there's sort of public statements, but again, that sort of sense of Neema's book as being so profoundly invested in this community, in contrast to the way in which, as you said, Neema, I think Vance is willing even to throw his own mother under the bus. Proverbially, or grandmother, and not to mention his claim to Scots-Irish heritage, which he's also willing to talk about in a way that's so deeply pathologized as to be questionably worthy of even human life, and I think that's the extremes. I think that gets us to a little bit about bootstraps, if we can sort of zoom out a little bit to this idea. And this is for both or either of you. Can you talk a little bit about the bootstraps ideology, just to especially for our students, I think, but also for me, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, the ways in which it permeates a popular, I think, very misguided, obviously, view of Appalachia, and how some cultural voices reinforce that vision. We're talking about, I think, Murray and Vance and others, and no relation, by the way. I hope that's clear. But the cultural voices that reinforce that vision of the bootstraps ideology, because I think it's highly relevant to conversations in a place here like San Bernardino. And what do we do? So just if you could talk a little bit about the bootstraps ideologies, but also a little bit about what do we do to counter those ideologies? What do we do to answer them? They are so appealing in a sort of Hollywood, whether it's, you know, a Cinderella Man or Horatio Alger, these kind of things. There's such enormous appeal, and there's such an existing vocabulary of storytelling that fits into the bootstraps ideologies. How do we answer that, and how do we counter that? It's a sort of a big question, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
You know,
I
I
think
think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Liz.
No, I was just going to say, I think you just have to be honest about poverty. I think it's easy. I think you have to counter the bootstrap narrative, which is the idea, which is looks at a person's social position from a very individualistic way, and grants agency to that person to make large changes in their lives, manifest large changes in their lives by their own volition alone. So the bootstrap narrative is sort of like a evil stepsister to the false myth of the American dream, right? Where if you succeed, great, but if you don't, it's all your fault. And to counteract that, I mean, it's not hard. We just have to be honest. We have to say it's not the fault of poor people that, you know, people have to get healthcare from Amazon now. It's not the fault of poor people that they're building prisons in poor communities. It's not the fault of poor people that they're making, you know, $12 an hour working in hospitals. It's not the fault of poor people that housing prices are skyrocketing. It's not the fault of poor people that they cannot afford to live on what society gives them. It's not the fault of poor people if they're disabled and cannot work. And surprisingly, even though it's very easy, we don't do enough of it. And I think one of the reasons that we can't really be honest about it is because there are so many different coalitions of poor people and who are part of this conversation, and for various complex reasons, but let's be real, a lot of them have to do with racial lines that we haven't been able to organize together effectively against poverty, although there are like a large array of interest groups that do important work. There, you know, there's relatively few examples of large coalitions of poor people. And so one thing, you know, I hope that will change in the future. Apart from labor unions, there's really not a lot of, I would say, cross-racial, cross-class ways to effectively address some of the issues that are most pertinent to kind of like the everyday survival of people.
I think that the thing that is particularly dangerous about the bootstraps narrative is that if people don't have a really solid understanding of history and structures and systems, it is very easy to internalize also. So these narratives are constructed by people in power. I mean, go back to like, you know, like you can also relate the sort of bootstraps narrative to sort of the origins of white supremacy in our country, right? How do we divide poor white and poor black people? We convince poor white people that they have like a leg up and that they've earned that leg up in some way. But this is not just something that like exists for white people. I'm the child of immigrants. There are lots of South Asian people in this country who have bought that narrative whole and soul. JD Vance is married to one of them. So it is very easy to sort of believe that like you got what you got because you earned it, instead of indicting the systems that sort of like serve some people and don't serve others. So it creates division, right? And it creates this opportunity for people to sort of like have a narrative about themselves and about their advancement that it is sort of based on their hard work instead of looking at, well, what are the privileges that I have that other people don't have? What are the ways in which I've been given access and other people have been denied it? But I also think, you know, Liz, one of the most powerful parts of your book, I feel like, is the way you talk about Blair Mountain, right? And there's such an opportunity there. But I grew up 60 miles from Blair Mountain, and I did not learn that story in school. Nobody talked to me about the history of interracial labor solidarity until I was in grad school. And I drove by, I can't tell you the number of times I drove through Matewan. You know, it wasn't even in our narrative to talk about solidarity or to think about what it looks like for people to sort of like identify across racial lines, what are our shared issues of concern and how do we fight on those issues? And then what happens, like how dangerous is that to the government, right? That the government's willing to respond by dropping bombs on us because that idea of interracial solidarity threatens like the whole power structure in our country. When I think about Vance's work, like it just fits into that same frame, right? He believes that he achieved. He is somehow an exception. He advanced, everybody else is lacking. And he stands up and he sort of perpetuates that bootstraps idea again and again and again. But it's all in this context of like people often in the place aren't given the opportunity to consider other ways. Like we're denied the ability to learn that history. And if we don't know that it's possible, if we can't see the examples of where it's happened, I think it's really hard to envision that that could be possible again. And I think that is a real missed opportunity, or just intentionally so. Like I think we're kept from that information.
Thank you, Liz. We have a question in just a second here from a student in the classroom. First, my colleague, Mark Robinson, who's logging on Zoom, asked about sort of bringing everything right up to last night. Thank you both for visiting CSUSB. Can you each share some thoughts on the U.S. presidential race, last night's debate, and how the race is playing out in Appalachia from your perspective? And then after that, we're going to run down one question here in the room. And then if others have any questions or comments, we can maybe do a sort of one roundup after this.
I didn't watch the presidential debate last night. I have to admit, I went and took a long shower instead. But I think like, I mean, it's, I don't want to make a categorical statement like the support for the Vance and Trump ticket is less enthusiastic than it would have been in 2016, because I don't know, I kind of, I bubbled myself too, but I want to say that JD Vance's performance as a vice presidential candidate is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my entire life. I cannot think of somebody who has less charisma and is just like less funny. Like this is the thing about Appalachians. We are really, really funny, like deep down, and can take like a joke and are sarcastic and have like a really dark sense of humor, some of us. And the fact that he, it's terrible. So I don't really have any profound thoughts about the presidential election. I'm going to watch it play out like everybody else. But from where I'm sitting, yeah, it seems to be a little bit more lukewarm in terms of support than you would expect it to be if it was the same kind of context as 2016.
Yeah, I would agree. Unfortunately for him, I don't think anyone likes him. Like he's just not a very likable person. So I don't, I wrote a piece for The Guardian about him and I expected to get like a lot of troll energy. I know if I'd written that same article about Trump, I would have like had to take myself off all platforms because of the troll energy I got. And I got like 3 mean messages, right? On a piece that was seen by like many, 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 many people. He doesn't elicit positive feelings in many people. So I think in that way, if there was an expectation that he was going to like bring votes for Trump, I don't see that. I just also want to say, electoral politics have actually never served Appalachia. Ever. And they continue to not. Nothing got said at that debate last night that made me think that either of those candidates is actually centering the needs of Appalachian people, thinking about what's going on for them, knows what's happening in Appalachia, cares, or is going to do anything about it. So, you know, in some ways, I feel like when people vote, I often feel like it's, excuse my language, but I feel like it's fuck you voting, whether it's left or right. It's fuck everyone because no one's doing anything that actually has a meaningful impact on the lives of people in Appalachia. And I, you know, like Tim Waltz is a rural guy. Like, you know, his high school class had 24 people in it. Like, I'm hopeful that like there is someone potentially who could be in the White House who actually is from rural America and might therefore have some better understanding of what the complexities and challenges are and what we might do about them. But I wouldn't say in terms of policy positions, like either of them is saying anything that makes me think that Appalachia is being centered. And this is something Liz talks about in her work, but I think I also really believe, which is like every problem in Appalachia is actually an American problem. And if we were to like center folks in Appalachia and think about how to solve for the problems of Appalachia, we would solve them for much broader swaths of the country. But we never do that. Appalachia is never at the center of the conversation. So that's kind of what I think about electoral politics generally.
Thanks both. And thanks, Mark, for that question. A comment from Catherine. I teach, Catherine Osborne. I teach at a small college in Elkins, West Virginia, and Vance is largely seen as a joke by my students. I see that there's a question from Wynn and a question from Edwin. First, we have a question here in the classroom, so I'm going to run over here with the mic.
Good afternoon. I'm Miguel. Pleasure to be here with you guys. And you guys have mentioned throughout your lecture the Appalachia's role in American socialism and like labor movements and you know, the Pinkerton strikes and things. Is there any more like suggested reading for the history of communism, the like American Communist Party and socialism in America, and like Appalachia's role within that you guys would suggest? And do you guys see Appalachia playing a bigger role in advancing the left in the future of America?
I would say a really good book to read is by Jesse Wilkerson called To Live Here You Have to Fight. It's, you know, it's about women in labor movements, but it takes a really broad view of what labor is. And so it's a really good primer about Appalachian working class and sort of like what's been done historically. Now plug my sweetie, my booze book. My partner Josh Howard wrote a book called Hell's Not Far Off that just came out through West Virginia University Press. That's about a communist newspaper editor from Southwest Virginia and how he tried to connect himself to socialist and communist activists in the broader world. And it has a lot of interesting background about sort of the 1930s and who was the figureheads in this movement and how did they see their relationship to Appalachia. And if there's anything like more specific that you want to know about, I'm happy to email Professor Murray and get like some recommendations back to you as well.
Much. And Miguel, you have Dr. Katte's book right there too, right? So you've got a nice bibliography and a new book to read as well. Excellent. And thanks, Neema, for being on the spot with the links.
No worries. I also would just say, Miguel, in terms of your question about the left in Appalachia, I would say there's absolutely an opportunity, but that like what constitutes an electoral left and what would really be left in Appalachia are not the same thing right now, right? So I think if we had people who are really speaking to the lived conditions and speaking to like what solutions could look like, yeah, I think there's a real opportunity. I think people feel like a lot of people feel very disenfranchised by our sort of like political structure. But if you get down to sort of what they're talking about in terms of what they need and what's happening to them, there's absolutely opportunity there.
Neema, I'm going to read Wynn's question. And if it's okay with our guest, if we can keep you for just about 3 or 4 more minutes, just a few minutes over, if that's okay. And then I want to give everybody the opportunity for a sort of clearinghouse session on questions. But we have a few good ones queued up already here. Win says, you are both fantastic speakers. I had a question regarding the bootstrap narrative. Do you believe that this individualist narrative would be less rampant if the general public had a clearer understanding of social mobility, social stratification, and the intrinsic inequality present in these systems? Or is it too entrenched within the U.S. now to combat in that way?
You know, as a person in K-12 education, I would say that you can't ignore the impact of again, and this is on the left and the right, the nature of high stakes testing and standardization on people's opportunities to even learn about these ideas. There's not, like, young people aren't often getting access to the kind of education they would need to have a systems analysis. I absolutely think, like, I actually in 2016, I had my kids in Boston, like, learning about race and class in Appalachia and like trying to really understand sort of why were people coming up where they were coming. And my kids were able to sort of really make connections and be like, wait a minute, like there's actually a lot of similarities here. Like there are things I understand about this experience, and I can understand how both of us are sort of existing on margins, even though our margins maybe look different from each other. That opportunity is very limited in American schooling. And so I think I have to believe as a teacher that like if we gave people the opportunity to learn, it would make a difference, but we don't. Like a lot of the time you're not getting that kind of analysis until college, grad school. And so at that point, you know, we've funneled down to where a lot of people don't get that opportunity.
I would say too, one thing that's kind of prominent, I think, is this is speaking about white people specifically in Appalachia, is that there's not, sometimes for some people, there's not a lot of opportunities for cross-racial or cross-class socialization. And so when these messages come in about bootstrapping, about failure, and you think like, why on earth would somebody who's poor in Appalachia kind of believe these myths, right? The kind of context of those messages is really powerful. But what's on the other end of those messages is that, and someone's to blame for you being put down, you being at the bottom of the ladder. Somebody else is doing this to you, and that's sort of like the Trump messaging, right? It's always somebody else's fault, sort of a fictitious set of people. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why I think that there's like, people are surprised, but also not surprised to go and find people who are have quite reactionary politics on one hand, but are kind of soft and gentle to people of all, you know, people across racial lines and across class, you know, one-to-one. It's because the people that they think about that are taking these opportunities from them don't really exist. And to some degree that they know that they're fictionalized. So they can usually, they exempt people from these ideas. And so they have these kinds of, paradoxes going on in their head that makes it really hard to break down. It's like we need old-fashioned like consciousness raising sessions almost.
Thank you, Neema. Thank you, Liz. Neema said, I can't tell you the number of times I've been told that you and your family aren't that kind of immigrant. Right. A comment from Catherine Osborne. Do you think the recent Pulitzer winners by Barbara Kingsolver and Jane Ann Phillips are helping right some of the wrongs you've been discussing? And then if it's okay, I'm gonna wrap in one more question here. Then we're gonna move toward wrapping up so we can let our guests go. And I want to do a somewhat chaotic, quick a raffle, virtual raffle, and I'll mail out several copies of our guests' books to whoever wins, again, with sympathy to everybody who can't join because of the fires or joining from the other side of the country. But in addition, sorry to Catherine's note there, also Matthew Calloway jumped in. I'm an Appalachian, and appreciated how both your books confront stereotypes about how professional success requires leaving the region. Could you speak to that idea? And there might be, and Neema sent a nice answer to that, Salvation South. So those of you in the chat can go ahead and click on Neema's reply there. And Win said wonderful, insightful responses to the previous, thanks. So sorry, just the two notes from Matthew about being required to leave to have success, and the two recent Pulitzer winners by Kingsolver and Jane Ann Phillips. Maybe writing the conversation a little bit. So two wide-ranging questions. Oh, and Edwin, I'm sorry, can you please unmute? And we'll have three wide-ranging questions that our guests can choose to answer. Edwin, you should be able to unmute right now if you want to jump in with your question.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess starting off with a comment, I definitely related to one of the speaker's comments about Appalachia not being served by electoral politics. I kind of feel that with the Inland Empire. I mean, I don't think any of the major political party politicians have ever mentioned the Inland Empire, and even at the state level, I don't think our governor, Gavin Newsom, I can't think of him ever mentioning the Inland Empire either. And we have needs that are not really served. Our needs are not the same as the needs of Los Angeles or Orange County. So it's just like, what are some suggestions, or some ideas, how do you make politicians care about your region when it seems like they don't care about you,
I wish we knew.
Yeah. Sorry.
I don't know if you can make politicians care. I don't know. I mean, my instinct is always like, what makes anyone care is their proximity. So like the closer someone is, the more potential there is for them to care. That does not a guarantee. Again, like Vance theoretically is an example of proximity. There's a whole he's not from here, he's from here fight, which I think is irrelevant in some ways because he's so seen as from there, whether we think he is or not, he's claimed it. But his proximity is not given him empathy. His proximity has, I think, in some ways like poisoned him, or he's like misunderstood it. He's made trauma policy like in a way that's really concerning. So I don't know I don't know the answer. I think that ultimately like regions that aren't served by our political system aren't served because that system benefits from exploiting those places. The system benefits from exploiting Appalachia. That is a known, right? Like it is. There are lots of people in the United States in high positions of power who would be totally fine if no one lived in Appalachia anymore, because then you could frack the hell out of it. You could strip mine the living daylights out of it. You could just extract everything there was to extract, and there wouldn't be anyone there to fight, right? They don't have an investment in making it a place where people want to stay or live because they want to take everything out of it they can and then abandon it. So it's hard to know, but I think I think proximity can make a difference, but it's not a guarantee at all. I just wanted to go back to the question about Kingsolver and Phillips because I think it's an interesting one. I think that both of those books are important stories, but I'm not sure they do a ton to complicate narratives, which I think is the thing that Liz and I are both interested in, is counter narrative. I think that Kingsolver's book, Demon Copperhead, is trying to sort of like humanize and create empathy in some ways for someone in the throes of substance use disorder. But I'm not sure anyone reading that book understands a different Appalachia after reading it. So I think maybe it does like part of a thing, which is like having maybe people have a little bit more empathy or more understanding kind of, but I'm just not sure that it's complicating the narrative in the way that I would want the narrative to get complicated. I think in some ways, again, her book in particular, I mean, she is who she is, and she has like a very big footprint in publishing, but her book doesn't disrupt the dominant narrative about Appalachia, right? And so if part of the issue here is that mainstream media is really invested in a particular narrative, I don't think her book doesn't support that narrative. I think it kind of still does. And
Thanks, Neema.
not trying to talk out of church about Barbara Kingsolver, but just
Liz, did you want to jump in on any of those last couple questions?
I would say to Miguel, I did think that possibly disruption is one of the only reliable strategies to make people care about Appalachia. And as soon as I said it, I thought of like the West Virginia teacher strike. which happened just after the inauguration, the 2016 the inauguration. When Trump was in office, everybody was thinking like, oh, Appalachia is like hellhole of Trump supporters, that they're just apathetic. And then, West Virginia teachers rose up and went on strike, and were able to kind of get some concessions from the government. And then they were in the news and the whole narrative changed. And we were like in this conversation about like, okay, maybe we were wrong. Maybe so I would say, yeah, disruption is probably going to be the thing that gets us to the thing, right? We have to find a way to disrupt the status quo, and whether that means coming together, whether that means breaking off from our constituencies and kind of like rising those issues. That strategy will be important, but I think that's historically the way forward. And I think Barbara Kingsolver is the GOAT. I don't really have like great, strong opinions about. I think that there's like a level, there's a plane of Appalachian writers who have elevated themselves above kind of like the fray of arguing about stereotypes and what is or isn't Appalachia. It's like Lord of the Rings, where the elves go off into the undying land. Like they've done their time and they're free of the bullshit that we kind of have to kind of slog through. And I think that there's like a vast amount of Appalachian literature that sometimes we don't even recognize as Appalachian, because it's not kind of plugged into that conversation, the kind of like territorial or confrontational conversation about Appalachia. It just is. It's literature. And so, when someone like Barbara Kingsolver wins a Pulitzer Prize, I for a second, it has to like take my head to say like, oh, there's an Appalachian now who's won this award. I have to like, go into my head and kind of manually make that connection, just because they're so, they exist on a different plane from people like me.
Very much, Liz and Neema. We're 10 minutes over time, but for just a little bit of celebration, I'd like to ask Neema and Liz and Dean Lubas and I, the four of us, will all either think of or write down a number in between, to make it easy, 1 and 1,000. That'll make it really easy to find our winner. So any number between 1 and 1,000. I've got mine. Dean Lubas, tell us when you've got yours. Okay. Neema and Liz, you got your numbers? Okay, everybody, a rapid fire succession who would like me to mail you a copy of Neema Avashia's new book, please, in the chat. Here they come. All right. Okay, so everybody pick your winners, please. Let's see. 555, 273, 927, 12, 556, 670. And for this part, everybody, please feel free to log off if you have to run for a class. Everybody, thank you so much for joining. This is just going to be a fun little way to wrap up. Okay, I have my winner here, Patricia Moreno. I have 888, and so Patricia Moreno is my winner. And Patricia, please send, actually everybody who our guests are going to identify also as our winners, please, and our guests here in person already got their books. Please email me at that address, and email me with your mailing address, Patricia Moreno 818. Please email me at that email address, and with your mailing address. Let's see, Liz, Neema, Rebecca. Liz is lucky number 13. All right. I think I saw 12 you said in there. Did you see? Ooh, looks like Miranda may have won. Miranda, can you please email me? I think you're the closest. Alyssa nailed 13. Alyssa Taylor, you've got 13. That's Liz's number. Alyssa Taylor, please email me. Miranda Rexwinkle, please email me. And Neema, what's your number?
Mine was 55. So Crystal N got
Awesome.
got it on the dot.
Crystal, please email me at that email address. I think that's everybody. Awesome. Thank you, guys. There's my email address. This has been so much fun. Liz, Neema, I kept you now almost 15 minutes over, and we started late. Thank you so much for joining us. You can see me here. But I am so grateful to have just taken a small part in this session to host you, to correct this conversation. I am so sorry that JD Vance is out there ordering donuts. It is tragic for the people of Appalachia that he's trying to order donuts and calling himself Appalachian. It's a sad, sad story for everybody, but better days ahead, I hope.
Hey, Jeremy, can I just quickly say, Neema, thank you so much for doing this, for joining me. I haven't got to see you in action yet, and I was just astounded by all the context that you brought to these questions and your insights, and also your double tasking with the Zoom. I'm really in awe, and I'm just so impressed with everything that you do. So thank you for making this connection happen, and thank you, Jeremy, for being a great host.
Yes, likewise. Thank you, Jeremy, and Liz. Thanks for inviting me to be here with you. It was really an honor.
Thank you, Neema. Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Liz, for suggesting bringing in Neema and making this happen. I'm really grateful. And Dean Lubas, thank you. Thank you. This has been really, really insightful and a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing to follow your work.
Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.